So today I'm going to be unpacking the book Games People Play by Eric Berne. And this book has a special place in my heart. This is one of the first psychology books I ever read when I was in my early 20s. And I got to say, at the time, my comprehension was very poor. I probably only comprehended about 10%. But I've read it, I think, 5 or 6 times since over the years and keep coming back to it. And it's just so full of little nuggets. And it's a pretty short book. It's only about 150 pages, but it's very dense and there's a lot of stuff in here. And yeah, kind of my goal with making this video is to try to make these ideas as relatable and accessible. He wrote this book for professional psychotherapists in the 60s. So that kind of presents 2 problems. One, some of the language and the examples that he uses are a little dated. And the second thing is, his writing is a little clinical at times. So I was kind of thinking how to structure this because even though it's a short book, there's a lot of material here. And one of the things, this actually wasn't in the book, but this was in a 1966 interview that Eric Berne did. He said there's basically 6 ways that people interact with each other. Like if you put 2 people in a room together, there's basically one of 6 things that they will do. And he lists them. There's withdrawal, procedures, rituals, pastimes, games, and intimacy. And I would maybe include a 7th, operations, which is something he talks about a little bit. So I was thinking of just kind of going through these one by one, talking about what they are, giving some examples from my life or just from pop culture. Again, trying to make these ideas more accessible. One thing, I guess, before I get started going through these, the reason that he lists them in the way that they do is they're kind of moving from stages of almost no consciousness to when we get to intimacy, he talks about this as being like complete awareness, complete consciousness, complete presence. So that's something to kind of keep in mind as we're going through. Like as you'll hear, this first stage is withdrawal, where the person's just completely zoned out, or 2 people are just completely withdrawn. So yeah, let's dive in. So withdrawal is the first one. He says, a person can be there, present in body, but not in mind. And he says, quote, an individual can remain solitary even in the presence of others, as every school teacher knows. So he's referring here to like a student who is in math class watching a lecture, but, has completely zoned out and their mind is like on the other side of town, like at the swimming pool or something. So that's withdrawal. And, a lot of different things can cause a person to withdraw. One thing could be boredom, like in that example with the student. I actually just did a podcast on this as well. My guest was saying sometimes she'll withdraw when somebody is talking about sports. Like if you want her to just check out of the conversation, start talking about sports, and she'll withdraw. The other example I thought of kind of from pop culture is the movie Annie Hall. If anybody's seen that movie, Woody Allen film from the 60s, I think. And there's a scene where Woody Allen and Annie Hall are having sex, and then she completely withdraws. And the way they depict it in the movie is you kind of see like her ghost self like get out of her body and go over to the drawing board and like start doing some painting. And he's just like, I feel like you're not here. I feel like you're not present. And at least in that scenario, it's not clear whether she was like bored or he also says sometimes people withdraw to avoid intimacy. So that could have been the case, that she was kind of withdrawing to avoid intimacy. And that's also a theme that you'll see with all of these different kind of types of interactions is a lot of them, when we look at like why do people engage in them, a lot of the reason Berne thinks is to avoid intimacy, because intimacy is scary, hard, and potentially threatening. Yeah, so that's kind of the first one. Let's move on to what he calls procedures. Procedure is, quote, a series of simple, complementary adult transactions directed towards the manipulation of reality. So that sounds kind of more complex than it actually is. This is basically just 2 people doing an activity. So this would be like a doctor and a nurse removing an appendix, or 2 people setting the dinner table. So yeah, it's really just an activity. And again, going on this theme, he says, quote, some people use their work to avoid intimacy. So this would be somebody who is just constantly keeping busy doing things in effort to avoid intimacy. All right, so let's keep moving on. Rituals. So ritual is, quote, a stereotyped series of simple complementary transactions programmed by external social forces. And there's two types of ritual. There's the formal ritual, which is, as the name implies, a ritual with less room for variation. So this would be something like Catholic Mass. So if anybody's ever seen a Catholic Mass, you know that it's pretty much the exact same no matter where you are in the world, what culture you're in, which priest is conducting it, what time of year it is. It's always going to be the same, more or less. Whereas the informal ritual is a ritual with more room for variation. So this would be like a greeting ritual, like a hi, how you doing? Good, how are you? Nice weather we're having. Yeah, sure is. Like that ritual is it's an informal ritual because depending on what culture you're in, it's going to change depending on how well the people know each other, whether or not they're in a hurry, the people's mood, like all these things factor into the exact kind of moves that will take place in that kind of ritual. And again, kind of going on this theme of moving from less conscious to more conscious, this ritual is very it's very kind of mechanical in that, like, if we're engaging in a ritual, it doesn't take a lot of our conscious brain and effort. And, you've probably noticed that you can have this kind of, superficial greeting conversation with somebody without really being too engaged. We're kind of on autopilot when we're doing this. All right, so here's what, in my opinion, it gets kind of interesting. He says these greeting rituals are ultimately not about an exchange of information. So, it's not as if we're actually trying to, at this point, find out like how the other person is doing. And this is the case too, because if somebody were to be like, oh, hey, how's it going? And you were to actually be like, oh, really bad. Like, I'm really suffering from a lot of depression lately. They would be like, whoa, what? Like, that's not what they mean by how you doing. How you doing is more of, again, a ritual, a formality. And it's kind of two people acknowledging each other. They're kind of saying like, I see you, I acknowledge you, I recognize you. Berne says it's a way of saying like, you're okay. Or even like saying like, we're okay, like we're cool. An example I thought of from my life, I sell comedy tickets in Times Square. And a lot of times when I'll pass another ticket seller who I know, we don't have deep personal relationships, but like, we're cool. And usually when I'll see somebody, it's, like fist bump, what's going on? How you doing? There might be a like, how's it going tonight? How are sales kind of thing. But it's very much just like us both saying like, we're cool. Like everything's good with me. Everything's good with you. Everything's cool with our relationship. And yeah, again, if I were to kind of head nod somebody and they just stared at me, that would tell me like, oh, there's something wrong in this relationship. So now I want to talk about this idea of emotional stroking, which I think is really important to understand even this greeting ritual. So this is actually how he starts the book. He starts the book talking about stroking, and he starts talking about literal stroking. He's saying like when you look at the science, a lot of times children who are not physically handled and physically held and cared for when they're very young, like when they're babies, they either die or they grow up to be like really kind of emotionally messed up. There was a orphanage in Romania, or a few orphanages in Romania in the 80s, which were just completely understaffed, and there were just these children and infants left in rooms with no adults, and yeah, they didn't get any physical touch, and a lot of them died. A lot of them grew up with all kinds of psychological issues. So he's carrying this one step forward, and he says, okay, well, so we need this kind of stroking when we're infants from our mother, but then as we grow up, as we develop into adults, we still need this kind of stroking, but we start to try to get it through other ways, through what he calls like symbolic stroking. So this would be like something like a compliment, or like a nod of recognition, or like a fist bump or a smile. So he says, quote, he learns to do with more subtle, even symbolic forms of handling, until the merest nod of recognition may serve the purpose to some extent, although his original craving for physical contact may remain unabated. So yeah, he's kind of saying, even though that is how we are seeking the stroking, it doesn't really satisfy us completely to the extent that the physical stroking once did. And the other thing to note is, as we develop into adults, it becomes more and more individualized how we seek this stroking. So he says, quote, "A movie actor may require hundreds of strokes each week from anonymous and undifferentiated admirers to keep his spinal cord from shriveling, while a scientist may keep physically and mentally healthy on one stroke a year from a respected master." And yeah, I just thought that was so interesting how different people go about getting this recognition and validation from others. The other thing that's just super relevant now is, kind of social media and like the Instagram, the likes, like those are a lot, that's a form of stroking. We get the little heart and it's just like, oh, it's a little stroke. And this is a big point. He says intimacy is the only thing that will completely satisfy our need for stroking. And this made me think, this is a little different than somebody like Ralph Waldo Emerson, who in his essay Self-Reliance, he says, "Nothing will bring you peace but yourself." And he's saying there, like, if you're going about trying to seek external validation, ultimately that's a failed endeavor, and that you need to find that internal validation. You need to be able to validate yourself. Whereas Berne's kind of saying, in his own words, he's kind of saying it's intimacy, it's genuine connection with another person that is going to satisfy that need. So it is a little different nuance. Getting back to Berne and the greeting ritual. All right, so we were saying the purpose of these rituals are mostly about this kind of stroking that happens. And he says, quote, "It's almost as though people have a little machine or cash register in their head that was figuring out how much hello you said and how much they owe you back." So yeah, it's very interesting. And this is something that you'll notice if you've ever sent somebody a really long text and they just write back something like, "Cool." There's a part of your brain that's like, wait a minute, I just stroked them like 30 times and they gave me back one stroke. Like that calculation doesn't add up. And he says that if less strokes are given in return than a person thinks is appropriate, that person is going to feel hurt, rejected, or as he says, their spinal cord will shrivel slightly. And the other thing that can happen is rumors or reputational damage can start to accrue, which is, we've probably all experienced this of like, the kind of gossip of like, hey, I said hi to Joe the other day and he just like kind of looked at me like, what the fuck? So yeah, people can start to gossip about somebody who is doesn't hand out enough strokes. And for somebody who strokes too much, he says we can grow suspicious of that person. I thought this was funny. He says, quote, "As Mr. F hurries away, he thinks to himself, what has come over him all of a sudden? Is he selling insurance or something? In transactional terms, this reads, all he owes me is one stroke. Why is he giving me 5? There are a few different things that will depend on how many strokes are appropriate. So one would be how recently the two people saw each other. So this would be, I'm going to read this other example. So he says, let us now consider Mr. C and Mr. D, who pass each other about once a day, trade strokes, say hi, hi, and go their separate way. Mr. C goes on a month's vacation. The day after he returns, he encounters Mr. D as usual. If on this occasion Mr. D merely says hi and no more, Mr. C will be offended. His spinal cord will shrivel slightly. By his calculations, Mr. D and he owe each other at least 30 strokes. And yeah, again, this would be like if you ran into a friend that you hadn't seen in a long time out on the street and your friend was just like, hey, and then just left. You'd be like, whoa, whoa, whoa. Like, we were supposed to have 30 strokes of like, hey, so good seeing you. What's new? Like, there's just that unconscious calculation that will seem a bit off. Also, he says if two people have just seen each other and kind of exchange strokes and then see each other again, they will dramatically minimize the amount of strokes or not give any strokes. And I had a really funny example of this happen to me a couple weeks ago. I was leaving my Muay Thai class and I walked out with the instructor, and the two of us were kind of, just small talk, stroke conversation back and forth. Hey, like, what's new with you? Like, he was like, how long you been taking classes, whatever. And then he left and I stayed there because I was looking at something on my phone. And then he came back because he forgot something. And when he passed me, when he came back, this was only like 30 seconds later, I said hi to him again. I was like, hey. And he just looked at me, gave me a kind of weird look, and then just kept walking. And in his mind, it was kind of like, oh, we just stroked each other. Like, what are you doing, man? Like, we're done here. So I thought that was kind of a interesting tie into that idea. Let's move on to pastimes. He calls pastimes, quote, a series of semi-ritualistic, simple, complementary transactions arranged around a single field of material whose primary object is to structure an interval of time. Cool. So I might get a little flack for this, but pastimes are basically small talk. And for all intents and purposes, if there is a difference, it's a very small difference. So he says pastimes are typically played at parties. There's usually several different kinds of pastimes happening at something like a cocktail party. And some examples of these, he kind of gives them cute little names. He calls one how to. It's just two people talking about how to do something. How much? A couple people talking about how much something cost. Ever been? Two people, oh, you ever been to Jamaica? Do you know? Two people like, oh, do you know Jack from blah, blah, blah? What became of? Two people, oh, whatever became of that girl you were seeing, that kind of thing. And he also says, like, a good party host is going to basically set the agenda, is basically going to set up, because usually the host is the person that knows everybody. So they are kind of saying, like, hey, you two, like, meet this person and play this pastime together. So the way he says, a good hostess takes the situation in hand immediately and states the program. Come, girls, you have been playing wardrobe too long. Mr. J here is now a surgeon, and I'm sure he'd like to play Look Ma, No Hands, wouldn't you, Mr. J? I thought that was a funny example. I've definitely been in the situation at parties. I remember being at a Halloween party like a year ago, and yeah, a friend of mine was the host, and he kind of did the same thing. He was like, Zach, I think he was trying to fix me up with a girl there, and he was like, Zach, meet Katie, I forget her name. And then he goes, Zach just hiked part of the Appalachian Trail, and then he left. And it was kind of like, oh, he just stated the agenda. So it was like, oh, okay, I guess we'll play this little game now where I'm, telling her about my trip. So that's, ultimately what the host does. And he also says that people become annoyed when they are engaged in a pastime, and then a new person comes in and wants to play a different pastime. So he says, quote, a party of women who drop in at each other's house every morning for coffee to play delinquent husband. This is the pastime where women are complaining about their husbands. Are likely to give a cool reception to a new neighbor who wants to play sunny side up. This is where a woman is complimenting and saying how great of a husband she has. He says, if they are saying how mean their husbands are, it is too disconcerting to have a newcomer declare their husband is just marvelous, and they will not keep her long. And the example, kind of more modern example I thought of, there's a great skit from Inside Amy Schumer, the comedy skit where it's like a bunch of women in their 30s who are friends, like run into each other in the park, in Central Park. And the one woman will be like, oh my gosh, your hair looks so great. And then the other woman will deflect the compliment and be like, are you kidding? My hair looks terrible. And then they'd see a new friend and be like, oh my gosh, you look so thin. Have you been working out? And be like, are you kidding me? I look like a walrus. And then they see another friend and you're like, oh my gosh, you're, I forget what it was. Like, your eyes are just glowing today. And the woman's like, thanks. And they all just kind of stop and freeze and are just like, wait a minute. What? Because in that instance, like she broke the game. Like she's not playing this game that they're all playing. And, you know, in the skit, they start like pulling out guns and like shooting each other and stuff. Like it completely disrupted this state of harmony that they had, even though the harmony was about, you know, basically, deflecting compliments and whatnot. Okay, and then why do we small talk? This is probably a question that a lot of people ask who hate small talk. They're like, what the fuck's the point? Well, according to Berne, we do it for a couple reasons: to structure time so that we don't become bored and anxious. It allows people to stroke one another. It's another way of avoiding intimacy in his estimation. And it also, this was interesting to me, he said it's also kind of a way that we vet one another for who we want to have more complex relationships with. So like for looking for people who we want to play games with or have intimacy with. And yeah, so that would be like kind of like a first date, right? It would be like you guys might play this game of like this pastime of ever been, where you're like, oh, you ever been to blah, blah, blah? Oh yeah, I went there. Oh, cool. So you're kind of having this maybe more superficial chit chat. And if that goes well, according to both of you, you might move into more intimate conversation, more intimate relationship. So I like thinking of small talk as, kind of like a screening process. He sees it. Okay, now let's get into games. But before doing this, I kind of have to back up a little bit and lay this foundation, because there's a lot of transactional analysis terminology and ideas that we kind of need to unpack first before we get into talking about games and what they are and how people play them. There are these things that Berne calls ego states. An ego state is basically a system of feelings accompanied by a set of behavioral patterns. And he says, quote, ego states are not roles, but psychological realities. And I think these will start making a lot more sense when I start giving some examples. But basically, we all have a child ego state, a parent ego state, and an adult ego state. And everybody has these three states and kind of moves in between them throughout an interaction. Kind of in like a Jekyll and Hyde kind of way of like, okay, I can feel myself changing from my child to my parent. This is where his ideas are a little bit Freudian. The way that he thinks that we develop these is basically the child represents the way that we were as a child. The parent represents authority figures and our parents. So those things kind of get imprinted on us in childhood, according to Berne. So let's go through each of the states and kind of talk about them. So the parent ego state, this is you think, feel, and behave in ways your parents or authority figures acted when growing up. And there are two manifestations of the parent. There's the controlling parent, which is kind of judgmental and seeks to manipulate, has a lot of opinions about the way things ought to be. And then there's the nurturing parent, which is nurturing, caring, wants to look after people. And some of the things the parent might say is like, some of the things you might know if you're in your parent, you're saying things like, once and for all, or how many times have I told you, or poor thing, or disgusting, ridiculous, should, ought. Those kind of like evaluative words are a lot of times the parent state. All right, now the child state, you think, feel, and behave just like you did when you were a child. And there's two manifestations of the child as well. There's the adapted child. You act in ways as you did as a child when you adapted your behavior to authority figures. For example, you feel shameful, embarrassed, or apologetic like you did when you were a child. Or the free child. You act in ways as you did when you didn't care what people thought and had no considerations for others. You did whatever you wanted to do. This would kind of be like Piaget's idea of like egocentrism. And some verbal cues you might hear if somebody's in their child, or if you're in your child, you might kind of hear this, I don't care, or it's not fair, or when I grow up, or I was even thinking like the Lil Nas X song where he's like, can't nobody tell me nothing. That's very much egocentric child. Like, you can't tell me anything. Like, I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to put my shoes on. All right, adult. This is you think, feel, and behave in the here and now and are able to draw on your full life experience. This is objective, realistic thinking, feeling, and behavior. Spontaneous responses to the here and now. Whereas the adult, in his view, is the only one of these ego states which is not based on past conditioning. And yeah, the adult basically allows us to interact in the real world and think rationally, make estimates. Some of the things the adult might say is, it's possible, it's probable, I think, it's my opinion that. One of the goals of TA therapy is to kind of strengthen this adult ego state, because this adult ego state, again, is the only one that's not conditioned and is allow us to kind of rise above these just habitual patterns that we've been playing out. But it's also important to note that the parent and child are also useful. So it's not like we're trying to get rid of them completely. He says, quote, each type of ego state has its own vital value for the human organism. Each of them, parent, adult, and child, is entitled to equal respect and has its legitimate place in a full and productive life. So the child ego state allows a person to experience charm and pleasure, spontaneity, creativity. The parent ego state allows a person to effectively be an actual parent to a child. And it also kind of works as like a heuristic for, because we can't go about our day, being completely objective and, thinking about like, should I do this? Should I do that? We kind of need a heuristic to say like, this is the way things have always been. This is the way things are. So it is necessary to kind of just get through life, to have this parent. But obviously, if it becomes too dogmatic, then we kind of get into trouble. And then, the adult ego state is necessary for survival, making rational decisions, and regulating the child and parent ego states. Cool. So that's ego states. Now let's look at transactions. And transaction is kind of just a fancy term for interaction, but Berne doesn't like this word interaction. I think he calls it like a non-committal word. Because he uses the word transaction, and that like in a transaction, both people are getting something out of it. Like you can imagine like a financial transaction. I am getting a good or service in exchange for money. Both people are getting something out of it. And that's the way he sees every, interaction. The reason that we talk to each other, in Berne's view, is because we're both getting something from it. The reason that we play games, like when we get to games, you'll see both people have a payoff. Both people have a reason for playing the game. So that's important to kind of keep in mind. Okay, and then the analysis part of it, of transactional analysis, is when we look at what ego state each player in the game is coming from when they are speaking. So, player one might say something from their parent to player two's child, and player two might respond from their child to player one's parent. So that's where we get into this transactional analysis. So let's look at some different kinds of transactions. There's what he calls complementary transaction. So this would be where a person responds from the ego state that the other person directed their stimulus to. And this is like the one I just mentioned. So if player one speaks from their parent to player two's child, player two responds from their child to their parent, that's complementary because it's, basically a back and forth. It's kind of like a game of tennis. They're both responding to each other. And he says this kind of transaction can proceed smoothly and indefinitely. So let's look at a complementary transaction. The most basic one would be adult-adult. So player one initiates from their adult, player two responds from the adult. He says this is kind of like problem solving, basically. Two people simply and straightforwardly, objectively communicating. So an example from the book, a husband saying, "Do you know where my cufflinks are?" And his wife saying, "On the desk." All right, not super exciting, but exchange of information, problem solving, both responding from their adult. All right, now crossed transactions, as you could probably already guess, is when the person responds from a different ego state than the ego state the person directed their response to, directed their stimulus to. So this would be something like player 1 initiates from their adult to player 2's adult, but player 2 responds from their child to player 2's or to player 1's parent. So he calls this the most common crossed transaction and what causes most social difficulties in work, love, marriage, and friendship. So to use that same example, if player 1 initiated, "Do you know where my cufflinks are?" and player 2 responded, "You always blame me for everything," that would be adult, and then player 2 responding child to parent. And he says that these cross transactions basically break down either what will happen is the two people will just stop talking and just kind of stare at each other, or what will have to happen is one of the players, one of the people in the interaction will have to change the ego state in order to make it complementary. So if in the therapist or in the husband-wife example, if the wife says, you always blame me for everything, and the husband then switched to his parent and started saying, well, you shouldn't have took them, then it would become a complementary transaction and they could continue. Again, this wouldn't mean it would be like necessarily a fun transaction, but it could continue, I guess is the main point. Let's move on to what he calls the social level of communication and the psychological level of communication. I know this is a lot of kind of terminology and different frameworks, but this is really like the last one. And once we get this one, we're going to move into games. There's the social level of an interaction, which is basically what is said. This is kind of like the denotation. These are like the words that are being said. And then there's the psychological level, which is what is felt or what is implied. And something like what he calls a superficial transaction is where what is said, what happens at the social level, matches what happens on the psychological level. And this would be like that first adult transaction where I was like, "Hey, have you seen my cufflinks? Yeah, they're over on the chair." There's no game there, right? It's just what is said matches what is meant, matches what is felt. Whereas he calls an ulterior transaction, this is a transaction where the ego states at the social level are different from the ego states on the psychological level. And the example he uses in the book are something like a flirtatious game, where it's adult on the social level, but child on the psychological level. And the example he uses in the book is really kind of weird. The example he uses in the book is a cowboy saying, "Come and see the barn," and the woman visitor saying, "I've loved barns ever since I was a little girl." I don't know, maybe that's how people flirted in the 60s, but I'm going to use my own example because I think it illustrates it better, if I can say that. All right, so this would be on the social level, the man saying, "Are you good at riding the bull?" And then the woman saying, "Oh, I can ride all night long, cowboy." So on the social level, it's just an adult exchange of information. And it's kind of funny, the people who are actually don't understand flirting, a lot of times, they might come back to their friend and be like, "Oh my gosh, that girl was totally into you." And he'll be like, "Oh, she was just telling me she likes riding mechanical bulls or that she's good at it." Like the kind of, "Oh, it's completely over your head," is somebody that doesn't understand that there's these different levels of communication. But basically, so what's happening on the social level is this adult, but on the psychological level, this is child play. And what it might sound like if we were to kind of verbalize the psychological level, a man saying, "Are you good in bed?" and the woman saying, "Very good." All right, so when we get into games are these ulterior transactions where what is said on the social level doesn't match what is happening on the psychological level. So what that means is that all games are basically dishonest or have a kind of hidden agenda. So he says, quote, "Every game is basically dishonest and the outcome has a dramatic as distinct from merely exciting quality." And yeah, game moves appear to be honest but are actually concealed maneuvers to get a payoff. So that's really important. And it also differs from something that he calls an operation. So an operation, he says, is a simple transaction or set of transactions undertaken for a specific stated purpose. If somebody frankly asks for reassurance and gets it, that is an operation. So I think understanding operations really helps understand games, because an example of an operation would be somebody saying, like, I'm feeling insecure right now about how I look in this dress, and I need you to reassure me and tell me I look pretty. Right? That's very much adult. And that is somebody identifying a need they have and going about getting it in a very adult way. A game might look like this. I look so ugly in this dress. You're so much prettier than I am. And then waiting for a compliment. Right? So it's like what is happening at the social level there seems like adult, but is really child saying, hey, stroke me because I'm feeling insecure. The other thing, I think games, he doesn't say this in the book, but I think one of the reasons we play games is they allow us that plausible deniability, right? Because if we're, let's go back to the Flirtatious game with the cowboy and the cowgirl. If he were to say, like, hey, are you really good at riding the bull? And she were to go, fuck you, asshole. He could have the what? I was just asking you if you were good at riding the bull. Like, right? There's that kind of out built in. Whereas if he asked her, like, are you good in bed? Right? There's no wiggle room there. It's like you've stated what is the real thing. So I think plausible deniability is a big reason we play games. And it's also that we're not even, this is another huge point, is that these games are mostly unconscious. So that person who says, I look so ugly in this dress, they might not even be conscious that they're feeling insecure and wanting reassurance. They might just, again, be playing out this pattern, which, based on their conditioning, every time they've said, I look so ugly, they've gotten that kind of reassurance. So they've just kind of fallen into that habitual pattern. So yeah, getting on this point, he says, what we are concerned with here are the unconscious games played by innocent people engaged in ulterior transactions of which they are not fully aware. So yeah, something like a con man or even like a pickup artist who is basically consciously playing games. This isn't really what he's talking about here. He's talking about somebody who is unconscious of these games. And again, which is, we're kind of moving up from less conscious to more conscious. His whole thinking with the book is by becoming conscious of these games and identifying them, we can then notice ourselves doing it, move past them, and get into deeper things like intimacy. Okay, but before we get into intimacy, I want to go through some games that he lists. And he kind of categorizes these games. This is actually like the whole second half of the book. He has this Thesaurus of Games where he talks about the different moves. And he kind of classifies them similarly to like a zoologist or like a naturalist. So he's kind of like the Charles Darwin of like classifying games in the wild. So like giving them a name, giving them kind of like a genus and species. So there are dozens of them in the book. I'm just going to go through 4 of them kind of in detail and give some examples. And I've just picked these 4. They were the ones that really stuck out to me and seemed very, just interesting. All right, so this first game is called Look Ma, No Hands. And I love these titles because they kind of give you like a little snap image. You can kind of see a little boy on a swing set saying like, look, Mom, no hands. And that captures it perfectly. So it's one player coming from their child wanting some kind of stroking or validation from player 2's parent. So the moves in this game, player 1 says or does something with the intent of showing off to player 2 or to get a stroke. Player 2 awards the person a stroke or doesn't. So the payoffs for player 1 are pretty obvious: to get this recognition or approval from player 2 to get stroked. But the payoff for player 2 is not as immediately obvious. And he doesn't state it explicitly in the book. I kind of took a little bit of liberty with this. He kind of implies this, but maybe this is more of my own idea, that for player 2, the payoff is to assert themselves as being above player 1 or sitting in judgment of them. So a few examples of this. These are my examples. He didn't give a whole lot of examples of this one in the book. So an example might be a man on a date saying, "Sorry, I'm late. I was cleaning my yacht." And the woman responding, "Ooh, you have a yacht. Nice." So on the social level, that seems like an adult, I was just providing factual information. But on the psychological level, it's much more child-parent, whereas the man is kind of saying, "Look what I have, please stroke me." And she's kind of saying, "Yes, that's deserving of a stroke." And this game, I know I use some dating examples, but this game is everywhere. And like, I find myself playing it all the time, even in something like therapy, right? Where it's like telling my therapist something, and then I kind of have to be like, did I say that because I wanted his validation or his stroke? And right, that's a Freudian idea too, because Freud was all about the therapist oftentimes represents the patient's father. And that's what transference is. The patient wanting that validation from the symbolic father who is the therapist. So that's a that's a fun one to catch yourself doing. And then the antithesis, he kind of at the end of this gives the anecdote. For this would be like adult relating, or kind of this Thomas Harris, this "I'm okay, you're okay" kind of relating of kind of, the kind of disposition of like, I like you, you like me, or like, I'm okay, you're okay, you don't need to prove anything, I don't need to prove anything. I think this would be kind of the antidote to this this dynamic. All right, next game. Now I've got you, you son of a bitch. Again, fucking great title. All right, the moves. Player 2 tries to pull one over on player 1. Player 1 learns of the deception. Player 1 waits for player 2 to fall into their trap. Player 1 scorns player 2 for their deception. Excuse me. So the example he uses from the book is a game of poker in which player 1 is dealt a great hand, but player 1 doesn't bet big. Like, he slow plays the hand in poker speak. And then player 2 bets really big and is trying to like buy the pot, right? He's trying to bluff and buy the pot. And player 1 thinks, now I've got you, you son of a bitch, and then gleefully calls his bet. So that's one example. Second example, this is a more social example, is a plumber. A plumber gives his customer an estimate for how much the installation will cost, promising that there's not going to be any external fees. And then after the installation, the plumber includes a few extra costs. The customer thinks to himself, now I've got you, you son of a bitch, and gleefully writes the plumber an angry letter, expressing that he had promised not to charge him more, and he did, and vents all this anger against him. And then the plumber backs down and removes the cost. Okay, so what's the payoff for player 1, the person who is catching the son of a bitch? He's able to offload all of his rage onto the plumber. So it might even not just be rage about the issue. Like, that issue might have pissed him off, but it might be like, I've got all this other pent-up rage from all these other things in my life, and now this person, screwed me over. Now I'm able to just dump all of that on him. They also enjoy this sense of delight over kind of holding power above the other person. That kind of glee of like, "Ooh, now I've got you, you son of a bitch." They're also, he says, able to avoid their own shortcomings and confirm their belief that people are not to be trusted and people are always out to get you. Payoff for player 2, it's pretty obvious. They were trying to pull one over on the customer to make a few extra bucks. And this is parent-child, right? At the psychological level, it's basically the customer saying, "I've been watching you, hoping you'd make a slip." And the player saying, "You caught me this time." So parent, child, parent. So cool. And the antidote he says for that one is to basically just not try to pull one over on other people. He says, quote, the best antithesis is correct behavior. All right, next game. So it's called Why Don't You? Yes, But. So this was kind of like the first game that Berne ever discovered. He says it's the most common game played at parties. And all right, so the moves are player one presents a problem to either a person or a group of people. And then the player two, the person or the group of people, take turns offering solutions, usually starting with, why don't you? And then player one objects every solution, starting with, yes, but. And this might seem like adult relating at first glance. It might look like two people problem solving. And that's what it looks like on the social level. But the reason that he says this is a game is he says what is often happening on the psychological level is player one is trying to play the game of, I'll bet you can't solve this problem. And he's saying that each time that they are able to say why the solution won't work, they get a little sense of gratification of like, yeah, but that won't work because whatever. Oh, but that won't work because of this. And then eventually the biggest payoff comes at the end where the friend or friends are just silent and they're able to kind of think, haha, I told you I couldn't solve the problem. So their player one's payoff is to feel superior and to also feel reassured that there's nothing they have to do. There's no solution, so I guess I don't have to do anything. Player two's payoff is, again, a little more obscure, but to make player one grateful for their help. Maybe player two is somebody with a kind of like savior complex or somebody who gets that kind of satisfaction from solving somebody's problem, even if they didn't ask for their help. So yeah, the example in the book was, I won't read this whole example, but it's basically a woman with her friends seeking advice about the husband's poor carpentry. She's kind of saying, oh, well, that won't work because we don't have time. Oh, that won't work because, he doesn't know how to use power tools. Oh, that won't work because it costs too much. And yeah, again, at the child level, is basically saying, I'll bet you can't solve my problem. I'll bet you can't solve my problem. And he doesn't offer an antithesis to this one, which I was kind of bummed out. So I can't help you. I don't know how to not play this game. Other than, I guess, I guess you could frankly ask, like, are you actually trying to solve this problem? Or are you just trying to validate your belief that there's nothing you can do? Maybe. I could see that getting confrontational, though. I'm going to do one more. I know I'm running a little long, but hopefully you're still with me. This is If It Weren't For You. So he says this is the most common game played between spouses. So the moves are player one has a fear of doing X. Then player one selects a domineering player two who won't allow them to do X. Then player one blames player two for not being able to do X. So the example from the book is there's a wife who is afraid of being in new social situations. So she marries a domineering husband who won't allow her to be in new social situations. And then she blames her husband for not allowing her to be in social situations. So the payoffs are pretty obvious. She's able to avoid doing the thing she's afraid of while remaining unconscious of her fear and while feeling justified in having somebody to blame. And I guess the last payoff is a lot of times the player two who is domineering will feel guilty about not allowing them to do that thing and, shower them with gifts or some other type of, reward. I do also want to say, obviously, this is not saying that is the only reason that people marry abusive or domineering people. There's obviously this isn't the only reason that happens, but yeah, maybe it is something to be introspective of if you are in a kind of domineering relationship of like, oh, did I put myself here because it is helping me avoid something that I'm afraid of. Cool. I'm coming down to the end. I got through all the games I wanted to talk about. Let's talk about intimacy. So, what is intimacy? In a 1966 interview, he says, quote, "Intimacy is a game-free, candid, frank relationship. Intimacy means the spontaneous, game-free candidness of an aware person, the liberation of the uncorrupted child in all its naivete, living in the here and now." And then he also, this was from I'm Okay, You're Okay. They say it's the ulterior quality is the antithesis of intimacy. So again, in intimacy, there is no psychological level being different than the social level. So it is much more like a superficial transaction. Superficial not in that it's not deep, superficial in that there's no disconnect, there's no kind of deception happening. Okay, the other thing he talks about intimacy as being is a step away from this kind of unconscious programming. He says, this was actually in the intro of the book, he says, quote, "Intimacy begins when the individual programming becomes more intense and both social patterning and the ulterior restrictions and motives begin to give way." So when a person is able to kind of rise above this kind of conditioning. And his ideas on intimacy, I thought, were kind of Buddhist almost, because he talks a lot about awareness and spontaneity and kind of, he doesn't use this term, but it's similar to the term beginner's mind in like Zen Buddhism. So he says awareness means the capacity to see a coffee pot and hear the birds sing in its own way and not the way one is taught. And he says, quote, "A little boy sees and hears birds with delight. Then the good father comes along and feels he should share the experience and help his son develop. He says, 'That's a jay and this is a sparrow.' The moment the little boy is concerned with what is a jay and what is a sparrow, he can no longer see the birds or hear them sing. Few people can still see and hear in the old way. The recovery of this ability is called here awareness." So again, I think that's super Buddhist. That idea of like you can no longer see things the way they are because you have all these preconceptions already. We've conditioned all these preconceptions. And it reminds me, like, there's the Zen story of the student going to the master and wanting to learn, but the student already thinks he knows everything. And the master gives him a cup of tea and fills the tea up to the top and then starts continuing pouring tea into the cup, and it's just running over. And the student says, "What are you doing? The tea is running all over." And the master says, "Well, that is like your mind. You already think your mind is already full, and I can't teach you anything. So until you empty your cup, we can't begin here." And essentially, that's what Berne is saying. We have to kind of empty our cup of this programming in order to reach this awareness, which will allow us to have intimacy. So really interesting idea. I've never thought of intimacy as being complete awareness, conscious awareness. He also calls it spontaneity. And that, again, it's us in the moment reacting in the here and now spontaneously to the situation, to the person in front of us, rather than, relying on these parent or child ego states. All right. And finally, I thought I'd wrap up by just reading this final paragraph because it's really dense and there's a lot of high-level ideas in here. So this is the title. It's just one paragraph. It's called "After Games, What?" He says, quote, "For certain fortunate people, there is something which transcends all classifications of behavior, and that is awareness. Something which rises above the programming of the past, and that is spontaneity. And something that is more rewarding than games, and that is intimacy. But all three of these may be frightening and even perilous to the unprepared. Perhaps they are better off as they are, seeking their solutions in popular techniques of social action, such as togetherness. This may mean that there is no hope for the human race, but there is hope for individual members of it. All right. So many ideas in there. I'm just going to kind of go through a few of them. One is this idea that intimacy is rare and that it's not available to everybody, which, I don't know, maybe it's a kind of elitist idea, but he kind of says, he says perhaps they, as in the people who are unprepared for intimacy, are better off as they are seeking their solutions in popular techniques such as social actions, such as togetherness. So he's kind of saying some people are, maybe it's better that some people just play games for the rest of their life. And that's the closest that they'll ever be able to come. And yeah, that intimacy is psychologically impossible for most people. I don't think that was in that paragraph, but somewhere else in the book. I wish he would have elaborated more on that. I'm curious to know why he thinks that. But he definitely thinks that. He also thinks that it is scary. He says, but all three of these may be frightening. Vulnerability is scary, right? You have none of that plausible deniability that I talked about earlier. And yeah, if you are intimate, honest with people can exploit that. They can take advantage of that trust. So it takes courage. It's also, he says, potentially dangerous. He says all three of these things may be frightening and even perilous to the unprepared. Again, I wish he would have expanded on that. I'm not sure why he thinks this is dangerous. Again, it could just be because you're open to exploitation. But other than that, I don't really know why he thinks it's dangerous. And then I just wanted to emphasize this very last point, which is he's saying intimacy is more rewarding than games. And yeah, I think that's definitely worth dwelling on, is that there's something better than the game. And again, referring to the book The Game by Neil Strauss, if anybody's read that game about, his life being a pickup artist, that's ultimately what he concludes, is that his, intimacy that he finds with his wife was much richer and rewarding than all of these kind of mind games and manipulations that he was playing with, these other women. Which I think that's a point a lot of people miss in that book. It's like, it's kind of ironic that book became kind of like the Bible for pickup artists, is that they kind of like didn't read that like, oh yeah, actually the guy discovered that games are actually not the best. Like there's something better. There's something beyond the game. Well, yeah, that's all I got. Hopefully these ideas again kind of struck a chord with you, and hopefully you're able to apply them in your life. Hopefully you're able to use them. Maybe there will be a revival of games people play.